can't agree with you.
That's a good point.
All right.
All right. Talk to you later.
just don't want to like knock the camera.
Yeah.
bag on there?
Yeah, of course. It's live streaming right now.
Yeah, and then it'll be up tomorrow on like the actual. Because it doesn't go up immediately.
Yeah, it does.
Oh, it does? I think it'll like do something.
Good
Yeah,
evening.
no, you can log in right now and watch it if you want.
Good evening. I welcome you all and thank you for braving the snow and some slippery roads tonight to come to this panel on the mental health needs of young Americans and the challenges these present to our current public policies to address them. My name is Brian Smith, and my colleague, Professor Henrik Schatzinger, and I are co-directors of the Center for Politics and the People at Ripon College. And the Center has the privilege tonight to co-sponsor this discussion with two important student groups on campus. One is called DREAM, which represents Disability, Rights, Education, and Activism Network. And the other one is Psy-Chi, the Ripon chapter of the National Honor Society in Psychology. Members of these organizations are here tonight, and some of them were your greeters at the door or in the parking lot. The reason we're hosting this panel together is because the issue of mental health among young Americans is becoming more challenging in our time. A recent survey of members of the National Association of Elementary School Principals indicated that mental health issues, student poverty, and management of student behavior were their top 3 concerns about students today. A study by Best Online Colleges identified 5 prevalent issues facing college students in our country today: depression, anxiety, suicide, eating disorders, and addiction. Yet, with tightening budgets at the local, state, and national levels, public services to address these needs have sometimes been cut or not expanded sufficiently or rapidly enough to meet these growing needs. The issue of mental health of young Americans hit home in a dramatic way at Ripon College a little over 2 years ago. On November 7th, 2016, one of our first-year students, Jack Baldwin, took his own life. It thoroughly shocked the entire campus. He was extremely talented, hardworking, super-achieving young man with a promising career in the military ahead of him. Why? Did we miss the signals? His dad, Kevin, since Jack's death, has been engaged in educating groups around Wisconsin and beyond about the pressures on young people today and how to be more aware of their struggles and the signals they send when they are in crisis. Thank you, Kevin, for being here tonight and for what you do to make us more aware of the issue of mental health among young Americans.
Thank you.
Jack would be proud of you.
Thank you.
We have invited 4 professionals this evening, 3 of whom were able to come because of the storm, who deal with different aspects of these challenges. Mental health professionals and journalists who write about the issues. To my left, Dr. Sara Reed is program head for Honest, Open, Proud at Rogers Behavioral Health in Brown Deer, Wisconsin. She holds a PhD from Michigan State University in ecological community psychology. Her research has focused on adolescent well-being and the development and evaluation of community-based programs designed to enhance youth mental, social, and emotional health. To Sara's left, Lindsay Lowe is a licensed mental health and substance abuse psychotherapist at Collaborative Wellness, professional counseling and consulting services here in Ripon. She has experience in residential treatment, inpatient mental health, county mental health, and jail recidivism reduction programming, and works with clients of all ages. She provides schools with on-site therapy, education and resources for students and staff, and sits on several area committees. And finally, to Lindsay's left, Rory Linnane is a reporter for the Milwaukee Journal Sentinel's Ideas Lab, which examines best practices for solving the region's problems. She has reported on youth mental health throughout Wisconsin for several years, and in 2018-19, she is a fellow with the Rosalind Carter Mental Health Journalism Program. The fourth invitee, Alan Borsuk, a journalist and senior fellow at Marquette Law School, writes extensively on educational policies in the state. Sometimes you read him in the Sunday Journal, but unfortunately he lives south of Milwaukee and tonight was not able to join us. So each panelist will speak for about 8 minutes. Then we'll have a few minutes for the panelists to react to each other. And then we'll open it up for a half hour or more, hopefully 40 minutes at least, for you folks to come to the microphone in the middle of the aisle and to address your questions or comments to the panelists. Rory will speak first, and she will share information about the rising youth suicide rate in Wisconsin, why mental health needs are increasing, what are the barriers to access mental health care, and what are some of the best approaches for improving youth mental health today. Then Sara will discuss the relationship between stigma and mental health, particularly how stigma is an impediment to seeking help, support, and treatment. And finally, Lindsay will explain the relationship between environment and mental health needs and acknowledge the core of where mental health concerns begin. So, our panelists will now address these issues.
Thank you so much. Thanks everyone for having me here today. It's great to see such a good turnout here to talk about this subject. So I have been covering youth mental health for a few years, which is a very rare thing to ever happen in my industry, to be able to stay on one topic for as long as I have. And I think the reason for that is because journalists in particular have been really quiet about suicide and mental health for so long. And the reason for that is based in a fear that by talking about suicide, we might cause other people to consider suicide, which is something that it's kind of a myth that exists in general in our society. And so we really learned that the only way to really do something about it is to talk about it. And as soon as we started talking about it, we realized how many people out there are wanting to be able to talk about this and have been really wishing that there was a space to have these conversations as a community. So that's been really cool to be a part of and see people really coming out and publicly sharing their stories. So it started off, I just had an assignment to look into teen suicide because journalists were around our network were feeling like they were just noticing that more and more young people were dying by suicide. And the first story we told was about Jonathan Westner in Wausau. And when we first sat down with his family, they really didn't know if they wanted to share his story with us. And they were dealing with a lot of stigma themselves at the time. They didn't want to see their child as having a mental health challenge because they worried about how that would paint him. But they decided to do it, and in the years since then, they have totally changed their perspective on it, and now realize that that it's okay that he was dealing with a mental health challenge. And I think for a lot of people who've lost loved ones to suicide, there's that horrible question of why did this happen? And what's really empowering is when you can take that question and turn it into what can we do moving forward. And I think we owe a lot of the progress we've made to people like you, Jack Baldwin's dad, and to a lot of survivors who are pushing us forward on this. So as I started looking into it, we did find that youth suicide is a problem that is getting worse. Over the past decade, the rate has been rising consistently nationwide, and in Wisconsin, it's been higher than the national average almost every year, about a quarter higher than the national average. In 2017, there were 1,772 minors who died by suicide nationwide. 38 were from Wisconsin. And then when you start to think about all of the people who thought about suicide and all of the people who are struggling with mental health challenges, the numbers just get huger and huger. In 2017, 7.8% of Wisconsin high school students said that they had attempted suicide, and 15% had said that they had made a plan. And then when you look at depression, Wisconsin ranks 8th for having the greatest prevalence of youth ages 12 to 17 who had at least one major depressive episode in the past year. On a survey, 27% of Wisconsin high school students said they had experienced symptoms of depression. So this is a problem that's affecting a lot of students across Wisconsin and something that continues to grow. One of the reasons for this is that we don't have we don't have enough mental health professionals, especially in rural and underserved communities. We're the 10th worst in the country for the number of youth with major depression who didn't receive any treatment. That's 66% of young people who said they'd experienced major depression did not receive any treatment. 12 of our counties have 0 psychiatrists, 11 have less than 1 full-time psychiatrist, and 3/4 have a significant shortage of psychiatrists. On top of that, a lot of these providers, about 1/3, don't accept Medicaid. So if you're on public insurance, it's very hard for you to find health care. So that was a lot of really sad facts, but throughout this series, I've really found a lot of hope in talking to young people and seeing how willing they are to be really vulnerable and share their own stories, because they really care about making this a topic that everyone can talk about. And talking about it is really the first step for us to be able to find solutions going forward. So I think I'm running out of time here. Is anyone timing me? Did I stop there?
Yes, you are.
Okay. Well, just to shed a little light on solutions, I've kind of looked all around the country at studies and experiments of what has worked best in schools. And one of the things we wrote about early on was how in Minnesota there is a lot of state funding for placing therapists in schools, which is something that Governor Walker then put in his budget as well, starting with $3.25 million for that, and Governor Evers has talked about increasing that amount going forward, which can fund things like what Lindsay will talk about more. She works in school environments, but when you can have therapists actually going into schools, you get a lot of efficiencies, because a lot of students who need care will not actually, their parents will not actually take them to a clinic outside of the school due to stigma and transportation barriers, cost barriers, and other barriers. So that's something we found to be really effective. Also, student-run groups are really effective, because a lot of research shows that students are much more likely to talk to their peers about issues that they're going through than to adults. And also, messaging created by peers tends to be more effective, and it speaks to students better than messaging created by adults. So one of those groups, called Sources of Strength, is active in Oshkosh and a few other districts around the state. So I will stop there. Thanks so much.
Thank you. Sara will pick up on this issue of Sara, on stigma.
So first of all, just thank you to the college for coordinating this extremely important event and for the audience, both in person and virtually, for coming together to talk about these important issues of our day. I've been to, nearly a dozen or so of these panels in the last year, and I think this is one of the better turnouts I've seen. So give yourselves a hand first and foremost. So I fully intended to just talk, but then I looked back at my emails and realized I had 8 minutes rather than 15, and thus I put together some notes at the last minute so I wouldn't go over too much. So first, I'm here representing WISE, the Wisconsin Initiative for Stigma Elimination, and we are a statewide coalition of both people and organizations related to mental health advocacy that have come together to really bring about programs and best practices related to stigma reduction. And many of our members, myself included, are actually people with lived experience too. So in the short time I have today, all of probably the 7 minutes or so I have left, I'm going to ask actually the audience's help to exemplify two kind of concrete points I'd like to make to further exemplify, I think, some of the statistics that Rory mentioned. So first, if you would, I want you to help me with a little bit of an experiment that exemplifies the prevalence of mental health challenges amongst young people. So, I would like you to please stand up if you know a young person, and I would say, for our sake, that's somebody under 24 years of age who is living with a mental health challenge, whether diagnosed or not. That is anxiety, depression, an eating disorder, substance abuse. I didn't even have to get through my list, unfortunately. So for those of you who are watching at home, virtually, I think every single person in the room is standing. And if you would, stay standing just a few more minutes. Any audience I do this with, no matter the location, the age, the makeup, you see the same exact thing. And that hurts my heart every single time it happens. But you also realize the power in numbers too, because each of you can also make a difference in those young people's lives. And I'm betting that you want to, because you're here tonight dedicating your time to this very important topic. So, a few more just quick statistics. Half of all mental health challenges begin when young people are 14 or younger. So that's really a prime opportunity for early intervention. And I want to again say that if we're to break it down and look at it, say in a typical classroom, 30 or so kids, that means that in that one classroom, about 3 people will have depression, 2 will be living with anxiety, 2 with ADHD, and maybe 1 with self-harming behavior or an eating disorder in every classroom on average. All right, now if I could get the last 6 rows to sit down and the first 2 rows to remain standing, if you would. Thank you. You've all been fabulous. All right, so now that approximately 80% of the room has sat down, I want us to pretend that those of you all still standing in the front 2 rows are the 20% of those young people who actually received any kind of treatment, any treatment for behavioral health care. 20% of young people access services. And if I point at you, if you would, just sit down as I do so. You all started treatment, but unfortunately your insurance ran out. So if you'd take a seat, I appreciate it, thank you. You really liked your therapist, but ran into a transportation issue. Right here. Your provider said something horrible to you and made you run for the corner. You never want to return again. And then about the remaining half actually receive effective treatment that positively impacts their lives. All right, thank you. That again hurts my heart every time I do this. So, but that is half of those young people who will receive good treatment and will become better and will become more, positive, healthy, well-adjusted individuals, because treatment does work. I want to dispel that myth as well, thinking that people will never recover. It's one of, I think, the most stigmatizing myths that does exist. So I was actually one of those fortunate young people who would have been sitting up here in the first row the 20% who was able to access care and then was able to receive good care too. So I just want to paint a slight picture. 16 years ago now, when I was 16 years old, a young person was living with an eating disorder. An obvious mental health challenge because it's one that is very visible. And yet, even as I would faint and be weak and be thin and jaundiced, nobody reached out and asked if I needed help, or asked what they could do, or voiced their concern. Until my mom did so, and fortunately I likely owe my life to her for being willing and able to confront me and to provide me with the care that I needed at that point in my life. But even though I can stand here today or sit here today and say that relatively proudly and comfortably, that was absolutely not the case when I was a young person and not the case for the vast majority of my life. In fact, when I was young, I was so incredibly ashamed and embarrassed that I flat out lied at times. I made excuses when I fainted. I said it was a virus. When I had to leave class to go to therapy, I forged my hall passes saying I was going to a medical doctor rather than a therapist. I just didn't want anybody to know, quite frankly. And so why did I act that way? I bet Rory knows. She knows the answer. Because oftentimes people who live with mental health challenges face something that can be just as detrimental, and that's stigma. Stigma, I believe, is one of the root causes of mental health challenges, as well as one of the leading drivers behind our low access to care and access to services. I mean, I'm looking around here, there's a lot of young people in the room, which is awesome to see. Life's hard enough as a young person, let alone as a young person with a mental health challenge who's living with a stigmatizing condition. So stigma, if I really break it down and put it into simplistic type of words, it's just simply treating people negatively or hurtfully as a function of who they are. In this case, as a function of them having a mental or behavioral health challenge. And stigma comes from all over. It does not exist in a vacuum. Any one person can experience it in multiple facets of his or her life, and often do, from their parents, their peers, their neighbors, potential partners, employers, teachers. And two of the main ways that it affects people, in my opinion and in the research that we've done through WISE, is that it leads to extreme isolation and extreme limiting beliefs about yourself and your own capacities and your worth. How many times, and by whom, do you need to hear that you're less than, that you're less likely to be successful, less likely to be happy, before you believe it yourselves? And that then becomes self-stigma, or what I think of more as self-shame. And when you develop these limiting beliefs about yourself, really understandable responses are to become either avoidant and think, why go to therapy? Why go to school? Why try to get a job? Why try out for that team? It limits so many of your prospects and opportunities. Or you might get angry and think, why try? Why try this therapy? Why try this new approach? Why take a risk? Why put myself out there only to be hurt again? Or you might become really apathetic and throw your hands up and say, why should I care? Why should other people care? So when recognizing the reality of the way that stigma can impact us and impact those people that we care about and that you all said that you know, we can see that it can create one of the biggest challenges of reaching out, of getting support, of getting care, and of living a happy, healthy, well-adjusted life. I'm not going to leave on too sour of a note, I promise. Every time I give this talk, I think, man, this is so depressing. Fortunately, as Rory said, solutions. And we know a lot about solutions, actually. So fortunately, we know that there's a relatively straightforward way of addressing both self and public stigma, and they really rest on a very similar approach. And the foremost way of doing so is to access people's stories of resilience and recovery and hope. and to be willing to share those stories ourselves. That is one of the main ways in which myths and misconceptions can really start to be debunked, which is why I think so highly of the Kids in Crisis series, because they provide a platform for young people to meaningfully share their stories with a large audience from a position of strength. And if they ever do a town hall meeting here, I really urge you to go and see them, because these kids just shine. They are so inspirational, I promise you. I have been so incredibly honored to be even a small part of it. So I also want to emphasize, sometimes we hear that education is the approach. Learn about mental health challenges, learn about different types of treatment and resources that are available. And yes, that type of learning can be helpful, but listening to those stories are all the more so, because it resonates with us more deeply when there are feelings involved. I could sit here all night and tell you the stats say that people who are bullies are more inclined to be suicidal than are those who are bullied. And you might leave here thinking that's the case, but the moment the news media shows a story of someone bullied who died by suicide, you might forget that point. Whereas if somebody who's a reformed bully were to share his or her story about their recovery, about the isolation they experienced, and why they did what they did, and the suicidality they experienced when they were young, you might be more inclined to believe it. All right, now I said that I wanted your help twice, so here's your next opportunity. It's really cut and dry, I promise. So this time, would you all stand up, please? Granted, those of you watching online need not do so. I can't hold you accountable, unfortunately. So just look around the room if you would. We have an excellent sized audience today. So as I said, you are all accountable for helping to make this a healthier, safer, more welcoming, inclusive environment for anyone living with a mental health challenge, not just young people. All right, I'm going to give you a list of 10 actionable items you can do to do just that. And you can sit. You don't need to stay there. But thank you for your participation. All right, number 1. So you do learn more about mental health challenges so that you can serve as a beacon of hope as well and start to address some of those myths and misconceptions that do exist, whether it's coming to panels like this, whether it's going to trainings, youth mental health first aid trainings, whether it's reading the fabulous articles that are done by the Kids in Crisis series. Learn what you can, and then don't leave it at the door. Teach it to others as well. Listen to people's stories and how not only they've been able to recover, but also how stigma affected them. You might be more inclined to make more of an effort to do some of these other things when realizing the damage it can cause people. Create safe spaces where people feel able to speak up. What do I mean by a safe space? Well, you can do a lot of things, but one thing that we urge through WISE is actually to display your intention to be a safe, supportive person for others. And so back at the resource table, there's actually a green-colored decal, and I would suggest that everyone take at least one. There's plenty more where that came from, which suggests you want to be a safe person for young people in their time of need, that you can be someone that they share their woes with, so to speak. And they are a completely free of charge resource. You can order as many as you want at safeperson.org. Again, that's safeperson.org, and we will ship them to you, and we will wish you well displaying them in your schools and in your community. You can also talk openly about mental health challenges. Each of you has a story too, I guarantee it. Even if you don't live with a mental health challenge yourselves, you know someone who does, or you've been affected by it because someone you care about has. Watch language. Our language is so incredibly important in terms of how we communicate to other people their worth, their value, how we think about them and their experiences. So avoid perpetuating those terms that have been hurtful, crazy, lunatic, what have you. Monitor media reports. Sorry, Rory. while the Sentinel, in your work, is fabulous, there really has to be a concerted effort to frame messages in a healthy, non-stigmatizing fashion. Speak up when you hear people who are being stigmatizing and hurtful. Someone tells a joke or uses a term that's offensive, make a comment, bring it to their attention. Number 8, lime green, is the color of mental health awareness. So there are bandanas in the back there that are lime green. Feel free to take some, and perhaps it will draw attention to yourselves, and people will be prompted to ask you where you got it. And then, who are my educators and my healthcare providers in the audience here? Or I see a lot of students, those who intend to go into either education or healthcare fields. All right, a good handful, especially in this corner. You are often the first responders when it comes to young people living with mental health challenges. Our teachers are actually the ones most likely to refer young people to care, more so than even their pediatricians. But that can be a hard and daunting task with everything else placed upon your plate. And so at WISE, we've really started to focus on helping the helpers and supporting those who are there, trying to show up and be their best for young people day in and day out. And then help bring more of these conversations to your communities, to your churches, to your schools, host other events such as this, try to make it to the Kids in Crisis Town Hall series. Just please feel free to share what you're learning here tonight. So thank you all. I think I'm still over time despite my notes, so thank you for bearing with me here. I always leave these events feeling so optimistic when so many people show up and are attentive, and it makes me feel a lot of hope. Thank you.
Thank you, Sara. Lindsay, will you share now with us the issue of what you see to be environment and how that affects mental health?
Sure.
Thank you.
I again also like to thank all of you for coming. You are a very big part of the puzzle to mental health, and not just mental health, but overall well-being. More and more research is coming out about what we already know, that the brain and body are connected, and we can't discount that. There are numerous research studies coming out about ACE, adverse childhood experiences, and I am so glad you brought up the topic of resilience, because resilience is another scoring system that we can use to really help people, and resilience is often more important than the adverse childhood experience themselves. We know that adverse childhood experience goes beyond life-changing traumatic events. It's something as simple as toxic stress. So coming home with too much homework, too many sports to engage in, not enough time to play with friends, not enough time to spend with family members or have meaningful relationships and meaningful discussions. So each and every one of you who is here is a huge part of each other's and your own resilience. Some of the experiences that I've had in counseling, I work with children as young as 4, all the way through the lifespan. And I've been working more and more with the younger population, so elementary school and middle school. And what we're really finding is when we get into early adulthood, we see almost more of a shell of people. They're really out of touch, and they don't know how to get in touch. And that's where a lot of the mental health concerns come from. So one of our big goals is to promote resilience, promote relationships, promote overall well-being, physical, mental, spiritual. And especially with young men, we're seeing that in the ages of 12, 13, 14, that's a really important developmental age. And that's when they are starting to really pull away from some important attachments in their life, and that's when they're starting to feel kind of lost and not really knowing where to go. So really supporting our youth is an important piece of overall well-being. I know both of these ladies up here also shared a lot about stigma and access to mental health care, and it's very difficult, especially as a provider in the field. There aren't enough of us. So if you've ever had an inkling to help somebody, see if you can pursue it, see where it might lead you. You all have a responsibility, and you all have a role in terms of community and supporting one another.
Thank you all. Would you want to interact? First of all, an applause for Lindsay Lowe. Do you want to ask each other any questions, follow up with each other, enhance or elaborate what someone has said?
I wanted to add something, because Sara so graciously brought up our events. Right now we're working on a documentary. I'm collaborating with PBS on it that follows 4 young people and their mental health journeys. It's going to be airing May 16th on Milwaukee PBS, and then we are going to make it available for people anywhere to host a screening for free. So we'll make the video available to you and give you some, like, a tool guide for making that happen. So if anyone's interested in that, please come talk to me after, exchange contact information about that.
Lindsay, so you mentioned the ACE study, the Adverse Childhood Experience work. Can you say a little bit more about findings related to early trauma and the outcomes that young people experience, and what some of the resilience work suggests is really influential in helping to get kids back on and
Sure.
Thanks. Thanks for
I didn't
bailing
want
out.
to elaborate too much because I didn't know if we'd have some questions about it.
Yeah, sure.
So, you know, the Adverse Childhood Experiences Scale, it's a series of 10 questions, and they're all the same. Everybody gets the same question. And they're questions such, they're yes or no, and for each yes answer, it's 1 point. And the questions are similar to, did you ever have a parent who was divorced? Yes or no. Did you ever have a parent who was incarcerated? Yes or no. Did somebody you know, or does somebody you know, use substances or overuse alcohol? Yes or no. Right? So there are a lot of very common things that we face in our daily lives and in our society. What the research shows is that for the ACE, let me back up. The ACE was formed from both medical providers and mental health providers that came together and were really looking at the dynamic and the relationship between childhood experiences and chronic health conditions. So really not even addressing the mental health part of it, really addressing physical chronic health. And what they found is that when you score a 4 or more out of 10, the likelihood of having a chronic illness, I think, increases at least 30%. So it's really astounding, and it really highlights the importance of the brain-body connection. And then resilience. Everybody's born with resilience. And some people are born with a little less resilience. It's all how the brain works and how the central nervous system communicates with the brain and with the body. And resilience goes hand in hand with how many adverse experiences you have as a young child. And the higher your adverse experiences and the lower your resilience, well, now we kind of have a perfect storm for somebody who's really struggling. And resilience looks at, again, very common questions. Do you have an adult that you can trust? Yes or no? When you were younger, did you have a neighbor or a friend that you felt like you could go to if you needed something? Yes or no? Did you have a parent home for you after school? You know, so it's looking at what your resilience score is, and as a professional, it's really helpful because then we can look at areas that we call them sparks, that we can grab onto and really foster and really grow, and while also trying to build some of the other resilience. The brain's resiliency can change over time. So you can grow resilience. If you have a teacher that you can go to, if you have a lunch lady who smiles at you and says, "How was your weekend? What did you do?" You are automatically helping that brain have more resilience. And the effects of the adverse childhood experiences start to go back down. So resiliency is huge, especially in our day and age when we are go, 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 go. And then when we're not going, we're usually teching out, maybe. I hate to go there, but you know, we have lost connection with other humans and even animals, so we've lost a lot of connection.
Before we open it to the audience, I'd like to ask the panelists to comment just on that last point. This generation of young people is the most connected in history through social media. But surveys have found that it's also the loneliest generation in a long time, because between 2000 and 2015, the percentage of teenagers in our country who hang out with their friends almost every day has decreased by over 40%. Now that relates to resilience. And I just wanted to ask you, what do you think social media's role in as a positive and a negative?
So thank you for mentioning the positive facet as well, because they do exist. I'm not one to demonize social media or screen time by any means, even though some research does show some pretty detrimental effects over the last 12 to 15 years in that regard. What it does provide us with communities of like individuals if we use it in a healthful, meaningful way. So I'm not sure how large the community here is, but I'm guessing not all that large. And so if you live with a relatively rare mental health challenge, let's say Tourette's or some kind of tic syndrome, there may be 2 or 3 of you in the whole community, in the whole town, and that has really provided a way for people to meaningfully connect with those who are like them in a relatively anonymous way that can be devoid of some of that stigma that you might experience face-to-face. And so I do want to say, used in that way, can actually provide a means of building a community sense of resilience, I would say. That being said, I think it's too simplistic to say it is social media or screen time that is directly related to the rise in mental health challenges. Rather, there are, I think, a lot of indirect effects. So it's some of what you alluded to. If you're engaging in social media, you're not doing other things. You're not being outside playing. You're not engaging face-to-face in meaningful conversation. You're not sleeping. A lot of other things that we know help to build health and wellness. And I actually think that last point, that the sleep deprivation is quite a large one. The more time you spend on your screen, the less quality sleep that you have, which we know is independently related to a lot of mental health challenges.
Yeah, to piggyback off of that, there's constructive screen time and there's passive screen time. And I think what a lot of us would like to look at and help kind of shift is the passive screen time. That constructive screen time, we're live streaming. So that's excellent, right? You have access to these types of opportunities for maybe parents or grandparents or caregivers that live out of state. FaceTime is amazing. You know, you are forming a connection. You are able to stay in touch with others, but I think the concern is really the passive screen time and, you know, what's really holding you back from having connection with others and kind of creating that shell instead of personality and growth and understanding of oneself. Thank you.
Can I weigh in on that one too? Or? Okay. Yeah, I agree there's a lot of nuance there, and I hate when I hear people just blame social media and iPhones for the problems of this generation, my generation. I think the broader issue is this like competition and comparison that teens do so much, and that's on all of us for creating that culture that we have. And social media can fuel that so easily because you can create this curated persona online, and then you're scrolling through, seeing all of your friends seeming like they're living perfect lives and seeing everything you're missing out on. And so that can definitely fuel that stress. But as Sara mentioned, I think it's also so important for young people to find communities online, especially LGBT kids who might not know anyone in their community who is like them. They can find communities online where they can finally feel free to be themselves. So yeah, I think there's a lot of nuance there.
This was apparently a popular question, so I want to mention one more thing. So I had you engage with me in 2 ways, and I promised you that would be the only 2, but I'm going to throw in a 3rd. So if you could, just, can everyone here take out their phones if you have it easily accessible? Okay. Sorry to steal your thunder, Rory. If I don't have it correct, please correct me. If you would put this in your phones, 741 741. That is the Hope Line, or the text line in Wisconsin, which is a 24/7 crisis and suicide prevention hotline, staffed with crisis interventionists, and they will text you until you want to text them no longer. They do really solid work. I know some of the folks who staff the line as well as some of the developers, and it's helpful to have that on hand if ever you're inclined to need some support or you encounter a young person who does.
Yeah, just to add on to that, it doesn't have to be something you're struggling with, but like I've used it before when I was like, I need some advice on like someone who's coming to me with the problem, and they talked it through with me and checking in on how it was going. So yeah, it's totally free to use, so I encourage you to try it out.
Thank you. Now, you've been a very patient audience, and you have followed all the instructions. So now you have your chance. We have a standing mic here in the middle aisle, and for the next half hour, we just ask people if you have a comment or a question. Ellen is putting on the mic. Stand close to the mic so we can hear you, and make your comment or question to one or all of the panelists. So go right ahead.
Hi, my question is mostly for Sara, although this is kind of an environmentally related question, so Lindsay, if you want to jump on this as well. You did talk about preventing stigma, so I don't know how much of an expert you are on like mental health in the college setting specifically, but how specifically in this college setting, especially one where we are living on campus for pretty much our entire college careers, how can we help to prevent and end stigma at a college, in a college environment?
Great question. Not an expert in that regard, but I was in college once upon a time myself, so have some personal experience. The rates of depression and anxiety amongst college students have also skyrocketed the last 10 to 12 years or so. It's an extremely competitive environment. And at times, depending on your field, I think there is excess impetus to not talk, either because you're concerned about how it might impact your professional life moving forward, or because it's so competitive, you're concerned you'll be thought weak or incapable in some way. I experienced that feeling myself in graduate school, and I was in a psychology program. It was extremely hush-hush, even though we knew oftentimes people who were struggling in silence. And so, what are some ideas that I think you might replicate here? I'm not asking you to reinvent the wheel by any means. There are some really fabulous college programs existing that you might check out. So one is called Stomp Out Stigma. It is a program at numerous colleges and universities that's related to stigma reduction. It uses stories as part of their platform, but also does walks, does awareness events, does panels such as this. There's also a really fabulous group called Active Minds, and they train speakers to share their stories of lived experience and then to travel around from school to school, both to decrease stigma, but also to connect with other students and student groups. And so those are a couple ideas. Might not be seem all that tangible because you have to take and develop it and create it right from scratch. So a good place to start, I think, is having conversations amongst yourself, reaching out, taking those decals and maybe putting them in your dormitory or giving them to your professors. Baby steps, right? There's a lot of you here tonight, and so connect after the fact. Thank you.
Thank you.
Second that. Talk. You know, talking about it and really taking ownership of what you guys are experiencing here in college is really important. And again, going back to the idea of resilience, right? Also talk about the positives. Talk about what is working. Talk about how you did make it through a really stressful night of studying or a big exam. Talk about what is helping and how you can help each other.
Yeah, I think sharing coping skills that work for you, and also just like normalizing and celebrating taking time for self-care is really important.
Thank you very much.
Hi, my name is Harlan Mitchell. I'm a politics major. I graduated last year. I'm familiar enough with the topic to know that there's an elephant in the room that we haven't been discussing, and that's the quality and nature of psychology as a discipline. I'm familiar enough to know with the social sciences as well as the standards for the regular sciences to know that, well, scientists are laughing at scientists who study physics and such laugh at psychology when it comes to the credence of their methods. I'm very familiar with them, and I'm not necessarily saying any of you are guilty of any of this. However, off the top of my head, the continued prevalence of psychotherapy, despite several issues regarding how the methodology is conducted, as well as the prevalence of fad therapies, I've heard of rebirthing, scream therapy, all sorts of crazy and nonsense things that, quite frankly, should not be taken seriously by scientists. As someone who is currently seeking mental health for a lot of reasons, I can't help but remember the fact that these stories are out there and they are common and continue to be brought up in psychology, as well as other social sciences. But that's a general critique here. I guess what would your responses be towards very valid issues regarding scientific rigor among studies, as well as the fact that the nature of the work done in psychology may in and of itself be creating this trap we're seeing when where people don't want to see it because, well, look at all these other psychology reports, therapies, etc., so on and so forth, that are proven to be snake oil, to put it bluntly.
Thank you for that question. I would say yes, psychology has the soft science sort of terminology often associated with it, which I actually think is quite unfortunate. Most scientists have some sketchy parts to their history and to their rigor, and some people who have acted immorally or unethically and then do so under the name of science or under the name of psychology, which is incredibly unfortunate. I would also say, though, it is a very young field. We are finding out a lot in a relatively short amount of time. It was only 40 years ago where sexual orientation was deemed a disorder. I think so. We certainly have a ways to go, but certainly not every form of psychotherapy or medication is detrimental. And so I think you have to take it with a grain of salt, so to speak.
To clarify, I am not necessarily saying it is detrimental. I am saying that the research that goes into showing that, yes, psychotherapy does work is often absolutely terrible. If we ignore the fact that even on a definitional level, psychotherapy has invalidated itself several times with numerous revisions to the point of, is Sigmund Freud even still here at a certain level? And that is the level of issues that I have seen in the social sciences in general. Psychology is both a nominal topic as well as a common topic for it to be brought up.
I can talk a little bit about psychotherapy, please. So psychotherapy, you're right. There's a lot out there, and it doesn't. There's not one size fits all model, and I think really going back to, again, the brain-body connection and looking at central nervous system, looking at things like how our brain waves react to toxic stress, things like that. We would do ourselves a disservice if we didn't try to address some of those things. talk therapy, which I think a lot of people correlate with psychotherapy, will only go so far. We know that emotions and experiences and the way that our brain stores those experiences is held in the nonverbal part of the brain. So we can talk about it all day long, but if we don't try to implement some other types of therapy strategies, it's not going to work very well.
And I'll just add that a lot of science is flawed in some way, shape, or form. There's often limitations to many studies. One way in which I think a lot of scientific research has been biased in some ways is through a preponderance of subjects who are often female or women, which then skews a lot of therapeutic approaches, such as talk therapy, to women, and has often been shown to be more effective with women. And so that is one way in which we are now finding that different therapeutic approaches work better either with certain population groups or communities by diversifying some of our approaches to research.
At risk of holding my turn a bit too long, I guess.
We do have to get some more questions. Thank you very much.
Thank you.
My name is Devin Baldwin, and thank you, Brian and Ripon College, for hosting this. One of the areas I've talked to several ROTC programs across the Great Lakes region. Recently, Western Michigan, Kalamazoo, we had over 80 cadets, and I take them through, what we experienced in our tragedy and the journey of recovery. One of the areas we really focus on mental health and resiliency is stimulants, and I don't think it gets enough attention. One of the contacts I reached out to is an MD out of Bethesda with Operation Supplement Safety. Her organization is a non-for-profit funded by the DOD, and she literally gets in and speaks to these groups, and they're turning their supplements, whether it's creatine or pre-workout mixes or diet mixes or steroids, certainly, to get that edge, be more competitive. What's really toxic that doesn't get enough attention is these high-powered caffeine products. Last month, I was at a safety security symposium facilitated by the former head of psychology at West Point, and they talked about suicide in law enforcement because they're not sleeping, because they've got rage, they've got anger. Stimulants are accelerants to depression, to anxiety. I believe in the case of our son Jack, that combinations of stimulants, energy drinks, and alcohol, as a first-year freshman, had unlimited access to that, were accelerants, and that he was a Corvette in an ice storm. What are we talking about from a health and wellness and the brain-body connection about how dangerous stimulants can be as accelerants to anxiety and depression? Thank you.
So I think a lot of mental health professionals approach things differently. I know more and more therapists and practitioners are being more inclusive in their intakes and in their initials and really looking at every facet. How much caffeine are you consuming a day? How many stimulants are you using? How many hours of sleep are you getting? And really trying to hone in on a person's own biological makeup, and then looking at, if that plays into, or how much that plays into some of their mental health that they're struggling with, and then also looking at how can we break the cycle, especially in college. You're drinking energy drinks to stay up so that you can get your homework done, so that you can deal with your stress, then you're out partying with your friends so that you can kind of cope with some of that stress, right? And so it's this cycle that we really do absolutely have to talk about and have to try to break and bring awareness to. Thank you.
Hello, my name is Jacob Meyer, and I'm a philosophy major here. My question is kind of straightforward. What information do you guys have about research being done or has been done about online communities, whether it be on social media or on more sort of traditional-ish platforms like YouTube and Twitch, platforms that are trying to mimic more traditional platforms?
I'm not quite sure I understand research related to social media use in what regard?
Effects on potentially resiliency, just anything kind of in general having to do with mental health and the effects of social media communities within that.
So this is anecdotal, this is not research related, it is my topical area of expertise at all. But I run a group, as you mentioned, called Honest, Open, Proud, or what is now called Up to Me, related to disclosure amongst young people, and means of disclosure, platforms for disclosure, how they communicate with each other about their mental health challenges. And it is oftentimes initially via social media that anonymity can feel safer in some ways. So whenever I ask adults, what do you think about social media disclosure? They're, oh no, that's a horrible idea. I hope my son or daughter would never even think of such a thing. But then when I ask young people the same question, they say, you know what, that's the only way I really feel safe. That's the only way I really have of finding someone who's like me. That's the only way, because of the anxiety I have, that I'm comfortable doing so, because I don't have to actually look at someone in the eye. I can think through what I want to say. I can practice it and rewrite it time and time again. And so I think there's definitely some advantages to it, potentially, again, if used constructively. But I would always urge there's pros and cons, and to certainly think through and make a well-informed, thoughtful choice as to whether that's a good option for you. Because parents have a point too. Once it's there, it could potentially stay there.
Thank you.
Thank you very much for being here. I appreciate the wisdom that you've given us. I want to make a comment, and then I want to ask a question. The comment, I was concerned that the audience might be left with the idea that psychologists don't know what they're doing, especially in a scientific way. Now, okay, I'm a psychology professor, I'm a licensed counseling psychologist, and I teach courses here. Just so everybody knows, the training of psychologist happens at many different levels. At the undergraduate level here, we start with a thorough scientific training. I would actually argue that compared to somebody who works in physics, psychologists learn more about the scientific method. No disrespect to physics, but if you roll a ball down a plank, that's very different from trying to test a human being. We have to very complex designs, randomized designs. I think we really have a high level of skill at this, and I'm talking about my undergraduate students, much less master's and doctoral level. Therapies are all tested. We use empirically supported therapies. We've become very scientific, but we found some unusual things. We found, in fact, that most of those different types of therapy, whether it's psychoanalysis or cognitive behavioral, guess what? They all work about the same. We didn't know that. We found that out scientifically. It turns out that more important is the relationship with the therapist. How do you feel about that person? Okay, Lindsay's a therapist. How would you feel talking to her? Do you think you could connect to her? Okay, so that's where a lot of the variance comes in, is simply that connection with the therapist. Even insurance companies will not reimburse unless you're using an empirically supported therapy. So you're protected. There are some strange things. We had a reading in our last course called pseudoscientific therapies, and yes, that birthing thing did happen. It doesn't happen anymore. Okay, so I don't want people to be worried about that. We're very careful with that. Now, my question for you: to what degree is this a political issue? As we talk about elections, as we talk about candidates, is this something that ought to be part of what a candidate tells you they stand for? And should we ask those kinds of questions at political debates?
% of the healthcare budget goes to mental health. 4%, a paltry 4%. Now, I might be biased, but I think it absolutely should be a part of many people's platforms because of all of the aspects of people's lives that it touches, right? So a lot of negative associations can come from having had either trauma in your background or living with a mental health challenge if you don't get adequate care and treatment. Things like school delinquency, things like higher rates of incarceration, things like lower rates of employment, things like being underemployed. A lot of really detrimental outcomes can be associated with untreated behavioral health challenges, which has a lot of implications for our society, our communities, our budgets, and what have you.
Yeah, I would just add that I think we've seen mental health have kind of a rare bipartisan support in Wisconsin. So there's a lot of things that go into mental health, like the ACEs that we were talking about before, where there's a lot of division on how to deal with that. But I think specifically on the issue of increasing funding for mental health care, we've seen people on both sides of the aisle in Wisconsin talk about that in their platforms. And I think because so much mental health funding comes from a state level and the federal level, it absolutely is a political issue.
And I would say there's big P policy issues and then there's small p policy issues at the organizational level or at the level of the town or the county, right? And so one thing that caught my attention at one of the Kids in Crisis Town Hall series was work being done in some communities where they're trying to make the school day start later and change the bus routes as a function of that because it's been shown to be associated with lower rates of depression and anxiety among students and staff who work within schools. And so much more tangible, manageable type of policy issues at a smaller level too can absolutely be relevant and make a difference.
Thank you.
Thank you for the panelists. I'm Hervé Sommet from the Educational Studies Department. And thank you for Joe Hatcher for providing me a segue to my comment and my question too about the political dimension of this question. I'm talking about the political dimension because I was very marveled by the very practical exercise that you give us here. And that gave me a very clear picture of what the mental problem is. It is clearly a personal problem, but at the same time, it's a political problem because the personal is political. Whatever problem you have at the individual problem, you may be struggling with this alone, but actually many other people are struggling with this problem. Because 80% of the people who stood up here all sat down when you told us to sit down, which means that actually is a problem that has to be taken, headlong by our political leaders. At the same time, you provided us with, strategies that I see lie more on the individual side. Yeah, people need to be compassionate, in society, but at the same time, the question that I'm going to ask here is, what can we do as a community, since we all agree now that it's a political problem? What can we do together in order to bring the politicians to book? Because they are not doing enough. 4% of the budget for this huge problem is certainly not doing what it's supposed to do. So what can we do as a group, as a community?
So that's a great question, and when I mentioned stigma, I absolutely did gear it towards individual level stigma, even though we know it exists at a community and a societal level in various ways. And so if I were to mention different forms of structural stigma that exist, those are the types that exist in the policies, the laws, the rules, and regulations of our society, of our culture. And so working to address those is absolutely something that you can do. So I mentioned access to insurance being a huge barrier, not only for getting people to care, but for staying in care long enough for it to be effective. That's one structural impediment, structural form of stigma that you can certainly advocate around. Another quite large one has to do with the media, and that's portrayals of people who live with behavioral health challenges of certain kind and the sort of framing that they have around it, and then how that affects a good number of people. So for example, suicide leads to more deaths every year than do war and homicides combined, and natural disasters, I'm sorry. And yet, what do we see on the news day in and day out? It's not stories of people's loss from suicide. It's not a reframing of those stories of people who are lost to suicide, but it's the wars and the homicides and the natural disasters that capture our attention. And so those are some of the big systemic type issues that at an individual level you can still rally around.
Yeah, I think I'd like to touch on that too. We are in 4 different school districts, and it's been interesting to see how each of those districts operate, and they operate very differently. And one thing that has really become clear is stigma, and it is more of an organizational level as to how involved schools get in mental health, in accessing the resources that are out there. We have some districts who go above and beyond and create new programs and try new things, and then we have other districts that just like zip their lips, you know, and so really it's looking also at the education system and really promoting within the education system and within those districts to not only care for themselves and their teachers and their staff, but also to just confront the problem and not really kind of, you know, put it under the rug or pretend it's not there or pretend that it's only certain demographics, because it is everybody. And we know from standardized testing and different things that schools have to meet, it's everywhere. They're all doing the same thing. It's just some districts and some administrators don't love to look at the problem. So really encouraging to break the stigma and to help use resources that are out there.
Thank you very much.
I'm Pastor Karen from Green Lake Federated Church, and I say that just because I have a lot of youth that I work with, a lot of young men especially, for whatever reason in my congregation have had real issues with mental health, including I'm a mom of 2 college-age sons, and one especially has difficulties with mental health issues. So I'm always looking for good, open-ended questions that I can ask that will help them open up. And one of my sons is in Missouri, one's up in Stevens Point, but they're both at a distance, and then the young men that have gone off to college and then have struggled with various forms of mental health issues. So not to not ask it for, are there specific questions, more gender specific for men that can be open-ended and helpful?
I think one thing I would really encourage, which is difficult if you know, your sons are away or people are away, but also this is where maybe some of that FaceTime could come in handy. I would look at body language. I would look at the nonverbal communication that is being shown to you. You know, the behavior will always tell a story. And I'm sorry, go ahead.
Yeah. Actually, so what I'm asking is, as somebody who wants to be supportive of them, and honestly with my kids, they won't do FaceTime at all, unfortunately, but what can I ask that would engender support to them?
I guess I would ask, do you need to ask a question, or could you make a statement? Mm-hmm. You know, like, hey, I hope you had a really good day today, tell me about it. Or, I want you to know that I would love to hear about this class or the test that you took. You know, I think when we ask, and what I'm finding with some of the young men that I work with, they don't want to be asked questions. Yeah, they want to kind of hear open-ended statements that they can then elaborate on and maybe talk about. And you'll get a lot of information, I think, that way.
I would also say whatever you're already doing, if you're asking, keep asking. Yes. Even if you don't get much of a response, that doesn't mean it goes unnoticed. It will be sorely missed were you to stop, I would say, even if I don't have the correct thing to ask your particular son. I would also say check out those decals that are in the back. They have a list of 7 different ways to interact with people who are experiencing a challenge of some way, shape, or form. So it doesn't give you exact questions, but sort of means of communicating that you care. So it's emphasizing their strengths. It's being a non-judgmental listener. It's only offering advice if it's asked, right? And so rather than going into fix-it mode, I think, which a lot of people in the helping professions might fall prey to, myself included, time and time again. And so it gives some sound words of wisdom on there. I would also say best practice with young men is actually, if you're concerned, not to say refer to them to some sort of behavioral health therapy, but rather to their primary care provider or pediatrician in a way that doesn't emphasize mental health per se. And so you might notice a behavior. Hey, I'm really concerned about your drinking. Hope you'd go talk to your doctor about that. And then they can be the one to make a reference to behavioral health services, because sometimes you're more apt to listen to someone other than your mother, unfortunately. That might be age-related, but that's one word of advice I would share.
Go ahead. We have time for just 2 more questions, so we have 2 people at the microphone, so go ahead and then we'll call it a night.
Okay, so you guys have touched a little bit on like education in like schools and like talking about both the resilience as well as like looking at like educating through stories. So how important would you guys say implementing like a program into K-12 schools that addresses educating students on mental health wellness as well as awareness? How would you say that would help reduce stigma and possibly mental health issues as a whole?
That'd be a fabulous idea. Some districts do it and do it well, and others don't. Some do so to a small degree, but maybe not as well as we would like. It sometimes comes down to an issue of resources, whether they have the staff to do so, whether they can carve out time in their schedules to do so. Sometimes it comes down to an issue of funding, as some programs do have a sizable fee related to them. Sometimes it comes down to, is what we know works, the programs that exist, culturally relevant here? So we have a lot of really good best practices related to both stigma reduction and mental health awareness, but a lot of it might not work in downtown Milwaukee, where they live with very different challenges than you do here. And so it's finding what works well for your community, having the access to those resources and the personnel, having the political clout, and realizing that a lot of schools, unfortunately, don't view mental health within their purview. And they get a lot of resistance, not just from staff or the administration, but sometimes from parents, too.
And I think, too, a lot of time districts wait until they're almost at a crisis level, instead of, again, like you said, implementing it really at the earliest stages. And whether they have funding or not, because I can say in these rural areas, even if you have the funding, the resources are overwhelmed. So you might not get the resources. But things that you can do are implementing different peer support groups. You know, that's something that you're just teaching kids how to take care of each other and how to support each other, and also how to not look for mental health issues per se, but really, how's my friend doing today? They've like seemed kind of down the past couple of days. You know, I'm going to play with them at recess. One very simple thing are the buddy bench that's at elementary schools. And so there are a lot of different things, even if the funding isn't there or the resources aren't there. It's being an advocate within your district or amongst your teachers.
I just wanted to add, it's so true that it tends to happen after a crisis. I think in a lot of the suicides we've reported on, right on the aftermath of that, the school is trying to figure out everything they can do, which is great. But I'd love it if schools were thinking about that more proactively. And our documentary is something that we're really hoping that teachers will use in their classroom as an easy way to quickly plug into something that is modern and relevant to students.
I do want to leave you with one program that's virtually available practically anywhere, or at least they have trainers. I'm pretty sure there would be some locally. It's called QPR, Question, Persuade, Refer, which is a suicide intervention. And it would help students feel more equipped to intervene if they were concerned about one of their peers or their friends. And there is a youth version. And so I would urge you, if you're interested in bringing that to your school, to maybe work with your administrators or your teachers to see if you can get a trainer.
And then could you also briefly touch on the importance of mental health wellness education? So what does it mean to be mentally healthy?
Okay, mentally healthy. That's kind of a loaded question because I think it's different for everybody. Everybody has their own level of self-care. They have a different idea of self-care. I think the overarching is awareness and understanding your own thought pattern, your own negative belief patterns. I know you touched on that in your early remarks. Our experiences teach us things, and sometimes those get stored negatively. So we start to think, well, I'm just stupid because I didn't do well on my math test. It's being aware of that and then learning how to take care of yourself to counterbalance that.
I think also a lot of traditional messaging around mental health and mental illness is really like diagnosis based, and so it's like, I don't know, has it been 2 weeks or more? Have I stopped doing my normal activities? What's a normal activity? Like you're trying to figure out what box you're in. And when you talk about mental wellness, it allows you to see it more on a spectrum and be able to just say, I felt stressed out today. And deal with like more, just to be able to speak more about what you're dealing with as an individual rather than trying to fit it into a certain diagnosis.
Thank you.
Questions for everyone, and so it's the question is, what's your take on the suicide on? I know you guys do research on the person himself, but what about the family environment or the home environment? Like, what's the take on that? As far as do research at school and as friends and social media, but what about the family? Like, what are the parents doing, or just the family itself? Because that goes as a whole circle. Because if that person kills himself, then it's going to just lead in a circle to where the parents don't blame, oh, we should have done this, we should have done that. And it's going to go back to, maybe you shouldn't have done that. But just what's your intake on the environment and what it should be, or what it could have been better, or how could parents know that it's signs or not?
I can try to address that, because I've talked to a lot of parents that have lost kids to suicide. So I think something that's really useful is to try to kind of change the mindset from reflecting on one specific situation, because you can ask that question over and over and not find an answer of what you could have done differently. But try to think more from a community perspective. How can we, moving forward, make sure that kids are more supported by an entire community? And I think, correct me if I'm wrong, but research shows that people who know someone who died by suicide become more at risk for that themselves. So in the aftermath of a suicide, it's really important to wrap around a whole family and all of their loved ones, and not tiptoe around it. I know people have talked about how when people die from other causes, the whole neighborhood's trying to sign up to bring casseroles over to your house, and when it's suicide, no one's calling. So I think it's really important to just really be there for families in that aftermath.
Were you looking for aftermath, or were you looking?
No, I'm good.
Okay, all right. Thank you.
I'd like to thank the panelists for a wonderful evening of wisdom and sharing with us, and hopefully we can take much with us to be able to help one another in this important area. before we leave, there are a couple of other people I would like to thank. Cindy Vertel and Emily Johnson are two very professional people who are serving this campus so well. We want to thank them and thank you for all you do and thank you for everything you're going to be doing in the future. Thank you so much, Cindy. And since we mentioned budgets, our Assemblywoman Joan Baldwin is here. She's been a great support to us over the last year in planning this event and making suggestions, so thank you, Joan, very much. Joan, keep working on that budget. Work across the aisle and keep it going up so that the services can be provided. We'd also like to thank the students tonight who've been a great help in planning and carrying this out. Olivia Heck and Abby Korb from Psi Chi, and the other members of Psi Chi are here. Would you please stand? We'd like to thank you very much. And Rachel Brand and Alex Clough and the other members of DREAM who've also sponsored this event. Would you please stand? We'd like to thank you. And last but not least, our videographer, Ellen Hughes, who has videographed this for the future. Thank you, Ellen. And thank you all for coming. We have a reception now for those of you who can stay, and I think our panelists, at least for a few minutes, will be available to answer more questions informally. But thank you so much, and carry with you the wisdom we learned tonight.